Well, welcome everyone to this four-part video series on Paul the Apostle. The title that we're working with is Falling in Love with Paul Again, a second look at the man and his message. I think Paul has potentially been interpreted, his theology has been interpreted incorrectly, and I think that he actually was an incredible trailblazer for his theology of the grace of God. So I want to tease that out over these next four times that we are together, and hopefully at the end of it you'll see what a remarkable person he was and how truly expansive his mind was and his theology was. Someone said that Paul is the second most important person in the origins of Christianity. Of course, the first would be Jesus, but that Paul was the second most important person in the origins of Christianity. Many people have, like I said, sort of a love-hate, appealing or appalling view of Paul, mostly based on some of the things, his references to slavery in his letters, the role of women and gender roles, and his understanding of sexuality and sexual orientation. And again, we have to factor in culture and mores of that time, but I have a hunch that he probably was much more open-minded than his writings reveal, but that he had to work within the context of his own culture. That said, again, some people have a very favorable or unfavorable opinion of him, and my goal is to help you to have a more favorable and a deep appreciation for him. So how do we know about Paul? We know about him because 13 of the documents or the books in the New Testament out of 27 are attributed to Paul. Now there is some speculation that perhaps he didn't write all of those letters, but my understanding is that none of the theology really differs from his, rather it's some of the writing style. So it could have been written or amended by some of his disciples, but 13 of those 27 books are attributed to Paul. And then get this, the book of Acts written by Luke the Apostle, the Acts of the Apostles, 16 of those 28 chapters in the Acts of the Apostles, which is a wonderful history book, feature Paul. They're all about Paul. So we have a lot of information. Half of our New Testament is written by Paul that contains his letters. Now, why did Paul become so influential, so important in the growing Christian church and the growing Christian faith? Well, because Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul was the chief proponent of welcoming Gentiles, that is non-Jews, into the Jewish Jesus movement. Whereas his contemporaries felt that that God's grace was really only for the Jewish people who lived within that covenant of following those laws, the dietary laws, the rules about Sabbath, etc., that you had to become a Jew if you were going to be a person of faith. And Paul welcomed Gentiles into, early on, what was really the Jewish faith. He was welcoming Gentiles into it, believing truly that God's call was to welcome everyone, not just people born into Jewish families. So Paul welcomed Gentiles into that early Jesus movement. The result of it really was the beginnings of a new religious tradition that sort of hatched out of Judaism after Paul died. I don't think that was Paul's intention. I think Paul's intention was simply expanding the tent of Judaism and welcoming more people into it. I don't think Jesus really intended to spawn a new religion, but rather expand the good news of God that was supposed to be expanded by the Jewish people. They really didn't intend to bring about a whole new religion. Paul's identity was as a Jewish person. That's who he was. And when he preached to the Gentiles, when he went out and preached to the Gentiles, He was introducing them to Yahweh, the God of Israel, not some other God, but to Yahweh, the God of Israel, saying that, guess what? You are welcomed by Yahweh as Jewish people are too. Now, Paul's influence was powerful, and it's continued for centuries. But if you look back in church history, here are some examples of some of the famous people, the famous leaders and theologians who were highly, highly influenced by Paul's writings. The first one is St. Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430 AD. Augustine was converted to the Christian faith after what? After reading a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans, specifically the 13th chapter. And as you may know, Augustine became the most influential theologian of the first 1,000 years of the church. Why? Because he was converted after reading a portion of Paul's letter to the Romans. And then, of course, we all know that Paul's writings were really the impetus for the theology behind the Protestant Reformation. For example, Martin Luther, in the 15th century, a Roman Catholic monk who was preparing lectures on what? On Paul's letters. And he got to the letter to the Romans, and he started reading it and contrasting Paul's writings about the laws that were laid out in the Hebrew Bible, and the idea of God's grace, God's unhindered welcome of all people. And then it changed Luther's life, all from reading Paul's letter to the Romans. And then, of course, there's John Calvin, who came a few years after Martin Luther. John Calvin is really the spiritual grandfather of the Reformed Church, of which the Presbyterian Church is a part. But much of Calvin's theology is based on his interpretations of Paul's theology of the covenant, and we'll talk more about that in the next video series, about Paul's theology of the covenant of grace. A covenant is with a group of people. And then also, Calvin was highly influenced about his ideas about church government based on what Paul had to say about it. And then the Methodists, John Wesley, the Anglican priest who became the leader of the American Methodist movement, he came into his experience of spiritual rebirth after what? After reading Luther's commentary on Romans, on Paul's letter to the Romans. The point is that Paul really is the primary theological and scriptural ancestor for most of us in the Protestant tradition. He really is. I mean, I grew up and cut my teeth reading Paul's letters in the New Testament. What about Roman Catholics? Here's the interesting part. Paul is simply not as central to most Roman Catholics. Who is? That would be Peter the Apostle. Peter the Apostle, and that comes from their understanding, the Catholic understanding of the 16th chapter of Matthew's Gospel about Peter being the rock and having the keys to the kingdom. But make no mistake about it, Paul and his letters contained in the New Testament were really the fires that started the Protestant Reformation. Also, please note that there are records of tensions between Peter and between Paul, and they are recorded in the New Testament, especially in the book of the Acts of the Apostles. And mostly they fight about circumcision and dietary laws. Peter was a Jew, and he felt that if you're going to become a faithful follower, then you need to become a Jew. And that means that men had to be circumcised and you had to follow the dietary laws and the Sabbath laws. Paul disagreed. We'll talk about that later too. And Paul called Peter a hypocrite. In the book of Galatians, Paul calls him a hypocrite. Now, interestingly enough, there's a lot of disagreement among contemporary Pauline scholars in our time who have come to question some of the theology or the interpretation of Paul's letters and the theology that has come out of it. It's very, very prominent now, and there's a lot of major disagreement, and we're going to talk more about that. about what Paul was actually talking about, Paul's understanding of grace and how it works, and Paul's understanding of something called justification. We'll talk more about that. But there's a lot of controversy right now that I find very exciting and also extremely liberating too. I want to talk briefly about the three worlds of Paul. Paul was an interesting person because he came from three different sort of competing cultures and contexts. The first is that he was a Jew. He was a Pharisaic Jew, and that's sort of like a sect within Judaism that they strongly adhered to following and keeping all of the protocol, the rituals, and the laws. He came out of that tradition, and some people would compare modern day fundamentalist Christians and that kind of mindset with Pharisaic Judaism. So that was a part of who Paul was. The second thing, he also was immersed in Greek Hellenistic culture that just permeated the Mediterranean world where Paul lived. Paul spoke Greek, and Paul very often used Greek philosophy to evangelize people. He used their own philosophy. Paul was an educated person, and he understood Greek philosophy and how to use Greek rhetoric in his theological arguments. And then finally, Paul was also immersed in a world that was the Roman Empire. And within that Roman Empire, there was the cult of the emperor. They had religion, but the emperor was God incarnate. And so Paul was a part of that. And Paul also was a citizen of Rome, even though he was a Jew. Again, we'll talk more about that. Now, real briefly, I want to mention, let's talk about Paul's biography. So, Paul was born Saul. Paul was not his first name. His real name was Saul, Saul of Tarsus. He was probably born shortly after the birth of Jesus. Most scholars think probably in the first 10 years of the first century, 1 to 10 AD, somewhere in there. So he would have been born just about the time or shortly after Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And that he lived into the mid-60s AD. So he probably lived to about the age of 55, which would have been fairly old back then. He grew up in this interesting place, this interesting small city called Tarsus. Tarsus was a very significant city in Asia Minor, and you can see that on the map now. It is in what is now modern-day Turkey. He was a Roman citizen, so his Jewish family ended up there. They were probably a product of the Jewish diaspora. That was after the fall of the first two Jewish kingdoms. A lot of the Jews fled Israel. This would have been 500 or 700 years earlier. Many were taken on as slaves, but many escaped capture, and some slaves stayed where they were even after they were emancipated. So there were Jews all over the Mediterranean world, and Paul's family was a part of it, and that they eventually were citizens of Rome. We know this because he says so. He talks about where he's from. In the book of Acts, he's talking in Greek to a Roman officer in Jerusalem, and Paul says, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city." In the 22nd chapter, he's speaking in front of a Jewish tribunal in Jerusalem. There it's in Aramaic, "I am a Jew born in Tarsus." Tarsus was the capital city of a Roman province, about 10 miles up from the Mediterranean Sea. It's still there today, but it's not a very important place. But it was when Saul was there. And Tarsus sat on the line between east and west, and that is between Greek, the Greek world, and the Semitic worlds of the Near East. It's an important place. We also understand that it was probably much like Louisiana, in that there was a lot of water, a lot of rivers, a lot of deltas, and a lot of mosquitoes. One of the theories of Paul's thorn in the flesh we'll talk more about that, is that perhaps he had contracted malaria as a young person, but it was a recurring malarial fever or something like that. But it was a place where mosquitoes were present, and probably malaria was very present. Tarsus also had a very fine Jewish synagogue and a school there, and it also had a Greek university that supposedly was better than the universities in Athens and Alexandria, a very fine Greek university. The atmosphere would have been like a very intellectual college town or city. It was very cultured. And it is thought that Paul received a very good Jewish education, while he was also at the very same time exposed to Greek philosophy and rhetoric. You can read his letters, you can read about him and his debates in the Acts of the Apostles, and you will know that Paul knew how to speak quickly on his feet. He was a good debater. Now, Paul tells us, both in the book of Acts, and also he mentions it briefly in some of his letters, he wants his people to know that he was once a very, very fervent, very militant Pharisaic Jew, that he would go to all sorts of ends, some of which were very malevolent and malicious, to try to do what he thought was God's will. For example, in Romans, in chapter 11, he said, I am an Israelite, I'm a descendant of Abraham, I'm a member of the tribe of Benjamin. He's laying out his history there. In his letter to the Corinthians, the second letter, 11th chapter, he said, I am a Hebrew, I am. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. And in his letter to the Galatians, the first chapter, he lets people know where he's coming from. In a way, confessing his sins, he says, I advanced in Judaism beyond many people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the tradition of my ancestors. And then in his letter to the Philippians, he says, I was circumcised on the 8th day. I'm a member of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. I am a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, I was a Pharisee. As to the righteousness under the law, I was blameless. In other words, Paul's saying, I did everything right. I did everything right, and yet I was empty. And then also Paul is called a Roman citizen in the book of Acts several times. And then Saul becomes a persecutor of the followers of Jesus. And he mentions this in his letters, how violently he persecuted these early believers, these people who believed that Jesus, in fact, was the Messiah and followed him. He says, I violently persecuted the church of God, and I was trying to destroy it. In Philippians, he said, as to zeal, I was a persecutor of the church of God, or the assembled people of God. In 1 Corinthians, he said, I am the least of the apostles. I am unfit even to be called an apostle because I persecuted the people of God. And in the book of Acts, he says, I was zealous for God. I persecuted the way. By the way, the way is what the early Christians were called the way. He said, up to the point of death, binding men and women and putting them in prison. So Paul used legal and sort of extra legal and lethal actions against people that he considered heretics against the God of Israel. I've often wondered, where did he get the authority to do that? Someone empowered him to do that. I don't have the answer for that now. Maybe I will later. And then, so what was the problem in Saul's eyes with these Christian Jews? The problem was that about their understanding of the kingdom of God and who is in it and who is not. Christian Jews claimed that the kingdom of God, which is not a kingdom with walls and guns and soldiers, but rather a grouping of people gathered around nonviolence and economic justice for all human beings. This had come on earth through Jesus. and that Gentiles, non-Jews, could be full members of this invisible household of God without following all the traditional Jewish conversion requirements, especially circumcision. And that was the problem. That was the problem. And Saul was very, very against this. He did not believe it. And so he went about trying to destroy or tamp down this movement before it grew and grew and grew. And it does say in the Acts chapter 9 that his authority, Acts chapter 9, the first verse, that he had been given a letter of authority from the high priest in Jerusalem to do that. I had forgotten that. Then, on one of these journeys, he was going to the city of Damascus, going there to persecute the followers of the way. He had what we now know and call a mystical experience. He talks about it 3 times and tries to describe it 3 times in the book of Acts. It is so important, it is so pivotal in his life that on that day he was absolutely changed and transformed, or the beginning of that transformation experience. It didn't happen in one day, but it was the beginning of it. As he was traveling, he was struck blind. He fell to the ground and he heard a voice. He did not see Jesus, but he heard a voice saying that it was the voice of the risen Jesus, asking him, why was he doing what he was doing? Why are you persecuting me? He saw the light, he fell to the ground, and he heard the voice. And in the end, the voice said, I am Jesus, and you are persecuting me. And his whole life was changed. Paul never saw Jesus in the flesh. He knew about him. He knew about his teachings. He knew that Jesus had been crucified by the Romans in Jerusalem, and he knew that people believed in him and were following him. That's about all he knew. His vision was probably a mix, of the crucified Jesus and the glorified risen Christ speaking to him. And when did that happen? As far as we can tell, it was probably between 2 and 5 years following the crucifixion of Jesus in Jerusalem. As Paul was going around trying to tamp down this growing movement, that's when he had his Damascus Road experience. So that's all for now. Next Sunday, we're going to talk about these 3 worlds of Paul. Paul, the Pharisaic Jew, Paul, the person who lived in the Greek culture, and Paul, who was a Roman citizen. Tease that out a little bit more so that you can understand the world out of which he was coming. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Sunday. Thank you.